Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sam Huggard. I'm the district superintendent for the New England District Association, and I'm so thankful that you've made this investment of time to be here at the pre-conference workshop prior to the start of our annual conference. I think the number of people that are here show just how important this subject matter is. And so I really thank you for investing this time into the church. I'm grateful for this. One of the recurring questions that I've gotten over the past couple years as I've met with leadership teams at churches and traveled around and spoken in evangelical free churches here in New England is the question, how can women flourish within the complementarian ethos of the EFCA? Now, there's many angles and some rough edges to this question. We in the EFCA are complementarian in our ethos. That is, we believe that God has created us male and female, equal and distinct. We believe that men and women have equal access to God through faith in Jesus Christ, and we're called together to follow Jesus and serve the church. We believe this service is to be done in distinct complementary roles. Yet, complementarianism is broad. Churches differ in how those roles are to be expressed, and churches have not always lived out this ethos well. The reality of abuse has been revealed to be all too common in the news reports over the past couple years. And this has made many people question if complementarian teaching itself is the problem. So as we consider this question, it's vital that we do three things today. First, anchor our understanding in the Scriptures. We are people of the Word. We believe that the Bible is to be believed in all that it teaches, obeyed in all that it requires, and trusted in all that it promises. Secondly, we want to understand the questions and concerns that are being raised by those outside and inside the church. We want to understand well the questions that are being posed. And then third, we want to seek to disciple and equip women to flourish in our churches according to God's design. This is good news from the Scriptures for us. So I'm delighted, first of all, that you are all here. And I'm also delighted to introduce today our first presenter, Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin. Let me give a little introduction here. Rebecca grew up in the UK and holds a PhD in English literature from Cambridge, not the Cambridge around here. And a theology degree from Oak Hill College in London. In 2008, she moved to America and spent 9 years with the Veritas Forum, where she served as the VP of Content and had the privilege of identifying and equipping Christian professors to speak about their faith in relation to their work. In September 2017, she co-founded Vocable Communications, which is a firm dedicated to helping leaders deliver messages that change minds. She is the author of a number of books. I know many of you have read them. These books include The Secular Creed, Engaging 5 Contemporary Claims, Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, and recently she's released Jesus Through the Eyes of Women. You can see some of these books on display out there in the lobby. Now, Rebecca is married, and she is the mother of 3 kids, and lives nearby outside Boston. I actually bumped into her this past week at a forum on the campus of Gordon Conwell, so it's nice having a local New Englander here speaking with us today. We're deeply honored to have you, Rebecca, with us, and I ask you all to join me in welcoming her today. Want me to pray for you?
Yes.
Lord, thank you so much that you are a giver of good gifts. You have given us most clearly your good gift in the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ. And God, we know you continue to give gifts to the church in the form of people. And we thank you that you've given Rebecca, Lord, as someone who knows you. She's been called to yourself through Jesus Christ, and someone who's been equipped, Lord, to be able to provide good gifts for the church. So God, I pray you'd bless her today. I pray you'd speak through her to us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for being here. There's one thing I hate about the setup, which is this. I never like standing behind things. So much as it would be more natural to stand here, I'm not going to. I'm sort of going to waddle from side to... I thought about no, that would be so wrong, like moving the Bible and stuff. That would just be wrong. So just know that I'm working with the constraints that I have. Yesterday, I finally faced the fact that my iPhone had died. It was no longer connecting to the cellular network. So I went to the local Apple store and I pleaded with them to help me. They sent me to AT&T and they said, we'll fix it with this little chip, and it didn't work. So I went back to the Apple store and ended up just realizing I had to buy a new phone. And I was talking with a young woman who was helping me do this. She had a little Our Father, Lord's Prayer on a necklace around her neck. And as we chatted, waiting for things to upload and download, she asked me a question. She said, is the dating culture in England like it is over here? And I was curious where that question was coming from, so I probed a little bit. She said a friend of hers had spent some time in England and had been surprised by the fact that British men were, quote, quite respectful. And then she came back to America and rediscovered that men in America only, quote, wanted one thing. I said to this young lady, because I'm a Christian, thank the good Lord, I've never actually been part of the dating culture, either in my homeland or in America. I would love to believe that the dating culture in the UK is actually very different from here. I don't think it is. And as we talked a little bit, it became clear to me that in the experience of her immediate friends, she had witnessed exactly the same kinds of things that many women of my generation witnessed as they engaged in the dating scene, whether in the UK or in the US. And that is that women today are not well. Women today are not being treated well. And much as many in our culture today would want to think that 21st century Western dating culture is so much better than it's ever been in the history of the world, it's actually just as bad as it's ever been in profound, important ways. So the things that I want to say to you this afternoon are less focused on how do we operate within the church, which my brother Bill is going to cover in a few minutes, and more thinking about how do we reach out beyond the church. What hope is there for us as Bible-believing Christians as we try to offer something truly compelling to the world outside? I firmly believe that women today need something not new but old. But they don't need something 50 years old. They actually need something 2,000 years old. They need the life and teachings and death and resurrection of a first century Jewish man named Jesus Christ, who radically changed the status of women forever afterwards. Now, I don't know about your neighborhood, but I'm going to make a guess that in your neighborhood, you see signs that look something like this. Raise your hand if this kind of sign looks familiar. Okay, yeah. It's not just in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the People's Republic of Cambridge, as it's sometimes called. In my neighborhood, as I drive to church, as I take my kids to school, I see many signs like this, which, as those of you who've read my book, The Secular Creed, will know that I think of as a secular creed. It begins, in this house we believe. And then there are a bundle of claims made together. Number 1, that Black lives matter. Number 2, that love is love. Number 3, that women's rights are human rights. And typically there's a sort of handful of other claims. I mean, this sign has, no human is illegal, science is real, and kindness is everything. But sometimes it's water is life, or diversity makes everyone stronger. There's a sort of handful of other claims. But most signs, in my experience, have some version at least of these top 3 claims. Often when I'm speaking to audiences, I'm helping them to disentangle claim 1 from claim 2. Because whereas many in our culture believe and claim that the idea that the lives of our Black brothers and sisters matter is inextricably, that's a complicated word, inextricably tied to the idea that same-sex marriage is equally valid to opposite-sex marriage for Christians. that these are tied up together. In fact, as you guys will know as people of the Word, the Bible points us in completely different directions when it comes to the lives of our black brothers and sisters mattering, and when it comes to endorsing same-sex marriage for believers. And likewise, as we look at this third claim, the idea that women's rights are human rights, which sadly in our culture is code for abortion is a fundamental right for women today. People believe that all of these claims are tied up together in the name of diversity, in the name of justice, in the name of human flourishing. And before I spend some time explaining why I think that's not true, I want to point out the fact that all of these three claims, even to the extent that they point us away from things that the scriptures affirm, are actually rooted in Christian soil. Let me explain what I mean by that and why it is relevant in particular to that third claim. To most of our neighbours and colleagues and other folks at the schools that our kids might go to, the idea that every human being, male or female, is fundamentally morally equal, whether they believe they're created or not, seems like basic moral common sense. And what does the Declaration of Independence say? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And for most in our culture today, there are some basic moral truths that don't require any religious grounding, like the idea that men and women are fundamentally morally equal, like the idea that universal human rights should be applied universally, like the idea that the strong and the rich and the powerful should not trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, but rather protect them. These seem like moral no-brainers. In fact, they're specifically Christian beliefs. What evidence do I have for that? Well, a couple of books written in the last few years by non-Christian historians. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this side because I'm sick of being over there. I like to pace usually, but pacing back there seems weird. Has anyone read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind? Well done, a couple of people love it. So this is a global bestseller written by an Israeli historian who is would identify as atheist. And he's looking at the history of humanity from a non-theistic perspective. And he says things like this: human beings have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. He says human rights are a figment of our fertile imaginations. Quoting the Declaration of Independence, he says, the Americans got the idea of human equality from Christianity, but if we've stopped believing in a God who created humans with souls and all of this stuff, what does it even mean to say human beings are fundamentally equal? He says the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with human rights and equality. Or another example, there's a British historian named Tom Holland. That's not Tom Holland, the Spider-Man actor, but Tom Holland, the historian. He was raised in a sort of culturally Christian environment in the UK, but absolutely lost interest in the Christian God when he was a boy. He said he was actually much more intrigued by the Greek and Roman gods than by the seemingly pathetic hero of Christianity. And he went on to study history and to become a sort of professional public historian, writing a number of popular books. One book of his that I read a couple of years ago is called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Anyone read that one? Oh, look, a couple more hands. I love it. It's very fat, but quite interesting. He's looking back over the last 2,000 years of Christianity in the West in particular. And in the process of researching and writing this book, he concluded that many of the beliefs that he, as an agnostic, held were in fact specifically Christian beliefs. I don't know if today he would quite be willing to publicly acknowledge himself as a Christian, but last I heard an interview that he did a year or so ago. He said it was like he was standing on the diving board, deciding whether or not to jump. But he's certainly realized that he can no longer hold on to this idea that there are basic moral common beliefs that require no particular justification, when in fact, they're Christian beliefs. And one of the things that Tom Holland notices in that book is that people on both sides of the major moral questions of our day, especially questions around gender and sexuality, are actually staking their territory on Christian ground, even when they are disagreeing with some of what the scriptures say. Because they are arguing on the basis of the fact that minorities should not be oppressed and trampled on by majorities. They're arguing on the basis of the idea that sex should not be coerced. They're arguing on the basis of the idea that men and women are fundamentally morally equal. Friends, that was not what most people in the ancient world into which Christianity was born thought. Not remotely. We saw it in their philosophy, as men were typically seen as sort of fundamentally superior to women, actually. And we saw it in their practice. Greek and Roman men were not expected to be faithful to their wives. It was fine for them to sleep with other women, also with other men, so long as they were in the correct role. The exploitation of women through prostitution was on a shocking and horrific scale. And here's the thing, nobody cared. The fact that you could buy sex with a woman for the same price as a loaf of bread, the fact that baby girls were abandoned, left to die or to be raised as slaves or prostitutes, nobody other than those women themselves cared. It wasn't seen as a moral problem. As Tom Holland puts it, a Roman man would no more have sort of had moral questions about using a prostitute to relieve his sexual urges than he would have had moral problems with using the roadside to relieve his desire to pee. Sorry to be a little bit kind of graphic there. But that is the first century culture into which Christianity was born. That is the world into which Jesus of Nazareth stepped. And there are eerie ways in which today's culture is resuscitating some of those ancient practices. And here's the irony. We've done it in the name of the liberation of women. I recently read a book by a woman named Christine Ember, who writes for the Washington Post. And she was raised evangelical. I believe her parents are Nigerian originally, though I can't swear to that. She then became Catholic. But she wrote a book that's not actually even particularly speaking from a Christian perspective. It's called Rethinking Sex. And the argument that Christine Ember is making in that book is drawing on empirical data on the one hand and reams of anecdotal evidence on the other, as she has interviewed woman after woman in, she's based in DC, so many women in DC, many women in New York City, many sort of educated, affluent women who, from the outside, we might imagine to be living the kind of feminist dream. Free choice in all things. And that was how the sexual revolution was sold to us, right? The liberation of women. For centuries, men had been finding ways to sneak around Christian marriage and have commitment-free sex, and great news, thanks to the pill, women could as well. But despite all these increases in freedoms and opportunities for women, women's self-reported happiness in America has actually declined since the sexual revolution. Why? Because actually commitment-free sex is a poison chalice, especially for women. For both men and women, stable marriage is correlated with multiple sort of mental and physical health benefits. But for women in particular, increasing our numbers of sexual partners is actually correlated with lower mental health outcomes, higher likelihoods of depression and suicidal ideation and drug abuse and alcoholism. And what Christine Ember is pointing to in her book is the fact that many women in our society today are living in a world where, yes, they may be consenting to sexual acts, although frankly they often are not. even at the basic level. But she's interviewing women who are feeling bad about the fact that they don't enjoy being choked by a man they just met. I mean, again, I'm sorry to have to say such sort of startling and disgusting things. But this is the culture that we as a society have created. We've created a culture of supposed freedom in which women are experiencing actually often sexual violence and being made to feel bad that they are not actually enjoying this. That in fact they are being profoundly hurt by this whole exploitative system. Because what happens when you remove all rules from a system? The strongest people win, right? I mean, this was one of the profound reversals that Christianity brought. Was the Son of God, the King of all the universe, who came not to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The one who had all the strength and power of God himself at his command and used it to die on a cross for the sake of weak and sinful people like us. The one who went around reaching out to, including, validating, elevating the weak and the poor and the marginalized, and often women. That was a sort of moral reversal that Jesus wrought. And when we take that whole paradigm out and we just sort of let everything play out according to the no rules culture that we have today, what happens is that those who are physically weaker get abused by those who are physically stronger. And it seems sort of, it's almost controversial to say this today, but it is a basic fact of biology that on average, men are physically stronger than women by a long chalk. So Christine Ember is having conversation after conversation with women who would see themselves as very secular, who aren't looking to religious foundations for how they're operating in the world, or expecting the men with whom they interact to operate according to religious foundations either, but are finding the situation that they're in extremely painful and frankly misogynistic. My title today is, Isn't Christianity Denigrating to Women? If you want to see women being denigrated, you need look no further than the majority of pornography that gets watched by heterosexual men in our culture today. You need look no further than the experiences of women of all ages who are participating in the dating scene, either in the US or in the UK and doubtless in other places as well. We're seeing the profound denigration of women in very exploitative ways. Now, what's the solution to this? Am I just saying, let's scroll back 50 years? Or let's scroll back 100 years? When people look at signs like this, when Christians look at signs like this and think, the world is going to hell in a handcart, that's often what they think that we should do. But let's be honest, if we scroll back 50 or 100 years, we find a culture in which the lives of black people are not at all seen as mattering as much as the lives of white people. People sometimes say to me, it must be really hard raising kids in Cambridge public schools in 2022. My kids go into school and they are continually confronted with profoundly non-Christian ways of thinking when it comes to gender and sexuality. That is hard. But I would find it even harder, I think, to raise children in a time of segregation, where I was having to say to my kids, because you are a Christian today, you need to cross the segregation lines. Let's not pretend that there was a once upon a time when we had this all right and everything's just started to go wrong since the 1960s. Yes, there are certainly some things that have gone wrong since the 1960s, but there are profoundly wrong things before as well, and the further we scroll back, we're never going to find this sort of promised land of the past that we can return to. And in some ways, well, that can be painful news for us to hear. There's one sense in which it's good news, because we're not trying to get back to a once upon a time, actually. We're trying to build a better future. One in which the lives of our black brothers and sisters do matter because they matter profoundly to Jesus, and one in which women matter for that very same reason, because they matter profoundly to Jesus. You know, in our culture today, people think that abortion is the fundamental plank of women's rights. But actually, I think the fundamental plank of women's rights is the cross. The cross was the place where the strongest man who ever lived died the weakest and most denigrating death for the sake of those he loves. And there is something particular about the design of women that pictures for us the beloved of Christ. As we open up our Bibles, we'll find that the connection between what Christians believe about sex and marriage, which is not that love is love, but that God is love, and that he gives us glimpses of his love through different kinds of human relationship. We'll find a connection between that and the rights of women in this beautiful, powerful, stunning, perplexing metaphor of Jesus and his people being a husband and a wife. You know, we see the beginnings of this in the Old Testament as not just as God creates man and woman, male and female, in his image, equally so, against much of what was believed in the ancient world, but also in the times when the prophets, time and again, compare God to a loving, faithful husband and Israel to his often unfaithful wife. You know, we see it when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history and declares that he is the bridegroom. We see it when Paul in Ephesians 5 says that human marriage is like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his church. And we see it in the book of Revelation when a great shout goes up, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and Jesus' marriage to his church brings heaven and earth back together. This is why marriage is male-female and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ in the church, it's a love across difference. Like Christ in the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ in the church, it's a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. Marriage is meant to point us to Christ, but it's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the best human romance could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. So when we look at our biology, when we see the difference of male and female, when we see the possibility of man and woman coming together and creating new life, we're seeing an embodied metaphor of Jesus' love for us. And I think one of the mistakes that we have made as Christians over many centuries, actually, is to, instead of locating what a woman is and why women are precious and who women are, in theology and biology, the two things that are profoundly given by God, we instead want to place a lot of weight on psychology. Now, I want to be a little bit careful here. We sometimes make statements about men and women that are like this. Men are taller than women, or men are stronger than women. What do I mean by that statement? I don't mean that every single man is taller than every single woman, or that every single man is stronger than every single woman. What I mean is that, on average, men are taller than women, and men are stronger than women. When it comes to how men and women operate psychologically, we'll sometimes make similar kinds of statements. And we're not careful to say what we're not meaning. You know, people sometimes say, well, women are more nurturing than men. I want to say, okay, like, very possibly. If we do like a broad study of psychology of men and women, it's very possibly the case that women are more nurturing than men. But we don't want to hang our theology on that, because actually any given woman and any given man may not be more or less nurturing than each other. Like that's not actually the place for us to anchor the things that we say about men and women out of the scriptures. Instead, we need to anchor the things that we say about men and the women out of the scriptures. I think this happens especially when we're talking about Christian marriage. I mentioned earlier that beautiful passage in Ephesians chapter 5, when Paul presents us with the purpose of Christian marriage. And interestingly, it's not primarily, according to what Paul's saying, the propagation of children. I mean, we know that is a profoundly important purpose of Christian marriage, right? But that's not actually even Paul's focus in Ephesians 5. He starts by making this shocking and countercultural claim, which it took a long time for me to get my head around as a young Christian. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. You know, you hear that by itself in our culture today, and you think, oh my goodness, what's going on here? We know from the Gospels that Jesus was continually elevating women. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But here is Paul seemingly sort of squishing them down again. But then we read on in the passage, and we hear, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We don't hear, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because women are naturally more submissive than men. We don't hear, husbands, lead your wives as Christ led the church, because men are natural leaders. We hear, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We see the cross as the model for Christian husbanding. Now again, play that tape back in the first century to a Greek or Roman man. Say, from now on, instead of using prostitutes, instead of sleeping with your slaves, male or female, instead of expecting your wife to serve you, you not only have to be faithful to that one woman, but you also have to pull yourself out in sacrificial love for her. Can you imagine that marketing campaign on Greek and Roman men? That's the picture that we're given. And it's not rooted in gendered psychology, it's actually rooted in Christ-centered theology. And today, in our conversations within the church about marriage, and as we think about what we are offering to those outside the church in our paradigms of sex and of marriage, we need to be careful that we are actually being scriptural and not just sort of grabbing on to some cultural or even Christian cultural stereotypes about men and women and sort of anchoring on that, but instead anchoring on what Paul tells us to anchor on, which is Jesus' relationship with his church. It makes me profoundly sad when people say that complementarian theology is a source of sexual abuse. But there's some truth in it, because a lot of what's been passed off as complementarian theology has very little to do with the scriptures. When complementarian theology sounds like wives, serve your husbands, because the husband's needs come first, the husband's job and aspirations come first, the husband is the one around whom everything centers, that's not what Paul is saying. Instead, people who actually believe what Paul is saying in Ephesians 5 should be the least likely men of all to abuse their wives. They should be men who are laying down their lives for their wives in tangible ways every day of their married life. That's the radical picture that Paul paints for us on the basis of the entire revealed word of God up to that point, and pointing us toward our glorious future when we will be united with Jesus in a way that human marriage today extraordinarily imperfectly pictures. That's the kind of vision of marriage and of sex and of safeness that we have to offer to those outside the church. But we need to be really, really careful that what we're offering to people in general and women in particular, both inside and outside the church, is not primarily marriage, but Jesus. I think it's fair, albeit slightly shocking to say, that marriage has for decades been an idol in many of our churches. We all know what an idol is, right? An idol is something that may well be good in itself, and Christian marriage is very good, but it's something that we elevate to a position where it just doesn't belong. When we say to our daughters that their highest calling one day will be to be a wife and a mother, we're actually misleading them. I'm a wife and a mother, they're great high callings. But the highest calling of every Christian male and female is to follow Jesus. And one of the fascinating things that we see in Jesus' relationships with women throughout the Gospels is they actually tend to have very little to do with the marital status of the women he's talking to. About a year ago, I started writing a book called Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, where I was working through the four Gospels, looking at the interactions Jesus has with the named and unnamed women in the Gospels sort of together. And rather than kind of looking at what do we see about women through the eyes of Jesus, actually to flip it around and say, what do we see of Jesus through the eyes of these women? And it's very striking that among Jesus' first full-fledged disciples were many women. Now, we often get confused because the 12 apostles sort of chosen especially to refigure the 12 tribes of Israel were all 12 Jewish men, right? And sometimes in the Gospels, the 12 are referred to as the disciples. But it's also very clear, and especially in Luke's Gospel, it's clear that there is a larger group of disciples who traveled with Jesus, and among them were a number of women. In Luke chapter 8, Luke tells us the names of three of these women in particular because he's citing them as eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. And later in the Gospels, we'll see that it's women who are cited in particular as eyewitnesses of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And in Luke 8, Jesus tells us about Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons have been cast out. It's funny, she goes on to become the most well-known of Jesus' female disciples because of her pivotal role in the resurrection stories. But we know very little about Mary Magdalene, other than that she'd had 7 demons cast out, which sounds like a kind of a rough life, right, before she met Jesus, and then that she traveled around with Jesus. The second woman Luke mentions is Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager. Now, I'd always kind of glossed over that name because, like, I didn't know, all right, Joanna, sure, who's Chusa, who's her, who cares? Like, I'm not disrespecting God's word, but, like, that was one of those sort of verses that I never really paused on until I started writing this book. And I was reading, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Richard Borkham, absolutely brilliant British Bible scholar who does amazing historical work around the Gospels, which I highly commend to you. And he has like a whole chapter in his book, Gospel Women, on what we can discern about Joanna from the details that Luke gives us. So Joanna was married to this guy, Chusa, who was a senior official in Herod's court. And she had left that life in order to traipse around the countryside with Jesus and these male disciples. And then we see Susanna, a third woman who has a less common name than Mary Magdalene or Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who have to be defined in other ways because their names are very common. Susanna has a less common name, but the three of them stand as sort of particular eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry in Luke's Gospel. And we see Jesus having some of his most meaty and profound theological conversations with women in the Gospels, right? You know, we've sometimes had Christian culture in which we expect men to be very sort of hungry for rich theological conversation, but women are happy doing crafts at the Christmas event and, maybe talking about what colour schemes are appropriate to Christian women. I don't know, I'm slightly caricaturing, but, we've all been there, right? Trying to make the doilies. I'm terrible at doilies. But if you look in John's Gospel, you see in John 4, Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, the longest private recorded conversation we have of Jesus with anybody in the Gospels. And they're not talking about colour schemes. They're talking about salvation. And I'd never realised this before. Famously, at the end of that conversation, she says to him, I know that Messiah, the one who's called Christ, when he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus says, I am the one speaking to you. Now, I'd always heard that this was the first time in John's Gospel that Jesus explicitly reveals himself as the Christ. And it's to this dodgy Samaritan woman at the well. What I never realized, it's actually also one of Jesus' I am statements. It's ego eimi. And we don't, the translations don't always, it's sort of awkward in English translation. It's actually also awkward in Greek. But Jesus says, I am the one speaking to you. And we're used to Jesus' I am statements, where he channels the name of the covenant name of God from the Old Testament, being coupled with something that will kind of help us understand more of who Jesus is. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I'll come to that in a second. But when Jesus says, I am the one speaking to you, what do we learn about him? We learn that he is willing, more than happy, to waste his time talking with this marginalized foreigner from the people group his people have been raised to hate, who's had 5 husbands and is now living with a man who's not her husband. He is the one who is speaking to her. We see it later in John's Gospel. It might be my favorite chapter of the Bible, depending on the day. And if you've read almost any of my books, you'll know I cannot resist talking about John chapter 11, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. My best friend Rachel laughs at me, because anytime I'll text her and I'll say, I had a great conversation with somebody at the party. And she'll be like, did you talk about John 11? I'm like, yes, I did. It's like a Bible crush that I have, where I just can't stop talking about John chapter 11. But so I'll just give the very, very short version. Jesus' friends, Mary and Martha, send a message to him saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. Fascinating. Not Lazarus, the one you love. And then John says that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so he didn't come. You're thinking, what on earth? I mean, if he loved them, surely he would have run as quickly as he could to get to Bethany and heal Lazarus. Or if he didn't love them, fine, like he had other things to do. But why does John say he loved them and then he didn't come? I think part of the reason, if we read through that chapter, is in order for him to have the conversation he then has with Martha, which, praise the Lord, has come down to us. When she runs out to meet him after Lazarus is dead and buried and says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And you can see the disappointment that Martha must have felt then. She, as many Jews then did, would have believed that at the end of time, God would raise his righteous from the dead. That's not why she's sent that message to Jesus. That's not why she was hoping that he would come. She says, yes, Lord, I believe that he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. And then Jesus says to her what? I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world. Those extraordinary words, I am the resurrection and the life, spoken to this woman with tears in her eyes. Was Martha a wife and mother? The text doesn't even tell us. But she was the person who Jesus disclosed those words to. Most of it, almost all his I am statements are spoken to groups, actually. This is one of the rare ones that is spoken to one individual woman and that sort of traveled down the centuries to us. We see time and again in the Gospels that Jesus is having these profound theological conversations with women. And if you read through Luke's gospel, I call my son Luke because I love Luke's gospel. Depending on the day, it may or may not be my favorite gospel. John, Luke, depends. But Luke's a better name than John. No offense to all the Johns in the room. If you read through Luke's gospel, you'll find that frequently men and women are sort of paralleled in the stories. And if there's ever a contrast, the women always come out better. We see it, for instance, when Jesus is at the house of Simon the Pharisee. And the sinful woman of the city comes in and starts weeping on his feet and washing his feet with her tears and wiping them with her hair. And Simon is horrified. And if Jesus was a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman this was who was touching him. And how does Jesus react to this sinful woman of the city? He holds her up as an example of love to Simon. He actually shames Simon for the ways that he has failed to show love, and shows what love looks like in a disciple of his, in this sinful woman. We see Jesus choosing to reveal himself first to a woman after his resurrection. Why do I say choosing? Well, we know from John's gospel that Peter and John were there, like they were around, they came, but Jesus actually revealed himself to Mary Magdalene and some of the other women. And if you look back over the last 2,000 years of church history, and if you look around the church today, not just in the US, but actually globally, you'll find that Jesus has always drawn more women than men. Now, I only have sort of theological speculations as to why that might be, but it's just demographically, as far as we can tell from historical sources and from demographics today, it just seems to be the case. You know, people sometimes write kind of lamentations about how the church in America is feminized, and so there are more women than men in churches. And I'm like, well, maybe, but then so was the first century church, and so is the church in China. And so, like, it seems that Jesus draws women disproportionately. The Greek philosopher Celsus laughed at Christianity in the 2nd century as a religion of women and slaves. And it was a caricature, but it was a caricature based in truth. Awful lot of women and an awful lot of slaves came to Jesus. And that rather cuts against our modern narrative that Christianity denigrates women, when in fact Jesus draws women in profound ways. A couple more things I really want to say, but I've realized I've lost track of time completely. How long have I spoken for?
Just over 45 minutes. You're good.
Okay, great. I'll say a couple more things then. It will not have two things will not have escaped your notice in the last couple of years. Number one, the transgender movement. And number two, the overturn of Roe v. Wade. If either of these are news to you, then I'm sorry. And I just want to talk for a couple of minutes before we do Q&A about how Jesus and the scriptures help us to think about both of these. So taking the second first, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is positioned in our culture today as a great blow against women's rights, right? I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were interviewing a woman who said, yeah, I feel so bad about Roe v. Wade being overturned because, I have a daughter and I have granddaughters. I was thinking, wow, in people's minds, it's like this is intrinsically an evil for women, that the universal right to abortion is being at least put down to the state. It's not like it's become illegal overnight, but that there is some erosion of that supposed right, as if this is a terrible thing for women. And before I say why it's not a terrible thing for women, but in fact the reverse, I want to just flag the fact that, and you'll know this, I'm sure, from non-Christian friends, my non-Christian friends as much see this as a justice issue as I do. It's not that they are kind of heartless baby killers. That's not where their heart is coming from. They think that they are on the side of care for the poor, protection of women, championing the marginalized. And unless we realize that that's what they think, even though I think they are profoundly wrong, we're not going to be able to have helpful conversations across this massive ideological difference. It was Christianity in the first place that placed value on infants. You remember that story in the Gospels when people are bringing, Luke puts it, even infants to Jesus. And his disciples say, he doesn't have time for this. And Jesus rebukes them and says, no, let the little children come to me. To such as these belongs the kingdom of God. Now that sounds like a nice story for us. It doesn't sound radically countercultural. But in the first century world, it really was. Little children were not seen as persons in their own right. They were seen as possessions. Jesus flipped that around. And his radical valuing of even infants was what eventually made it not okay, and when Christianity started to have any kind of political influence, this was one of the first things that happened, not okay to abandon your infants. It was the motivator for poor families being provided for, so they didn't feel like they had to abandon their infants. And today, now as then, the large majority of babies who die through abortion, which is a sort of form of abandonment, are babies that are being carried by poor women, right? This is not, the large majority, it's not sort of highly educated women living their feminist dream. It's poor women who don't think they can count on the father of their child for support or anybody else for support. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And it's only because of Christianity that the infanticide started to be seen as morally problematic rather than, well, your baby, do what you like with it. It's only because of Christianity we've started to see babies not as it, but as he or she, human beings made in the image of God. And here's the thing, if we pull Christianity out of the picture, if there is no God, if Jesus didn't come to reveal to us who God is and to die in our place and to give us hope of everlasting life, if none of that is true, then the baby in a mother's womb is just a collection of atoms and molecules. But if there is no God, and Jesus doesn't come to reveal to us who God is, to die in our place and to give us hope of everlasting life, that's just what I am too. And that's just what you are. We're a bunch of atoms and molecules. We're clumps of tissue. So it's actually Christianity that gives value and dignity both to the mother and to the child. And it's because of our Christian beliefs that we should want to care both for the mother and for the child in those scenarios. So that's just like a brief word on abortion. And I'll end with a brief word on the transgender movement. So I say, at the moment, these signs say women's rights are human rights. But the way that the transgender movement is moving at the moment, we actually no longer know what a woman is. As soon as we say, which we are saying today, which many in our culture are saying today, that transgender women are women, in other words, that somebody who is biologically male is as much a woman as I am, we no longer have a definition of a woman at all. All we have is stereotypes. If the transgender movement is correct and trans women are women, this claim is not worth the cardboard on which it's written on those signs. Because there's actually no such thing as a woman anymore. And one of the curious things that's happening at the moment, especially in the UK actually, though somewhat in the US as well, but I think in this respect the UK is sort of leading the way. There's an increasing number of secular feminist authors, thinkers, and leaders who are standing up and saying, actually, this is not okay. I've read a number of books recently by women who would consider themselves to be secular feminists. For example, a woman named Helen Joyce, who's a senior editor at The Economist magazine, very well-respected news outlet. And what they're saying is that actually the sort of supposed transgender rights movement is taking women's rights and tearing them up, tearing them to shreds. It's creating legal situations where women cannot be protected, where any man can opt into a women's prison rather than a men's prison and put women at risk, where any man actually can enter a shelter for battered women that previously protected women from exposure to men having already had the experience of being brutalized by men. We can wave goodbye to women's sports if transgender women are women, which oddly in America seems to be the thing that most kind of activates people. It's like, I mean, women's sports is great, but like it's strange that that's the thing that seems to be what people care about the most. And I want to be careful because it's always easy to oversimplify, and especially in this area, it's easy to oversimplify. Because under this sort of trans umbrella lies a huge range of different kinds of experience that will require different kinds of pastoral response from us as we engage with brothers and sisters who are struggling within the church and with folks outside the church. So I'm just going to give a very kind of brief sketch of some of the different categories. Prior to the last few years, historically, people who struggle with gender dysphoria, the sense that they were profoundly alienated from their sexed bodies and felt like they belonged much more in an oppositely sexed body, that was almost exclusively something that boys experienced, actually, rather than girls. It's not that there are no examples of females experiencing this, but it was very typically boys who from a young age would feel like they actually belonged much more as a girl than as a boy. For some significant proportion of those folks, that gender dysphoria did dissipate as they went through puberty and into adulthood. For some, it didn't. And there's a lot of debate as to the exact proportions, so I'm not even going to kind of argue about the exact proportions, but like some proportion of biological males who had felt profoundly alienated from their sex, that resolved, others it didn't. In the last few years, what we've seen is the massive rise of what's sometimes called rapid onset gender dysphoria, especially among adolescent girls, where young women who may never previously have shown any signs of being uncomfortable in their bodies or in the kind of culture around them as it dictates how girls and boys tend to operate, we're suddenly saying, actually, I want to identify as non-binary or as a trans boy. And this, unlike folks who've lived their whole lives with significant, painful gender dysphoria, this is something that in many instances does seem to be kind of caused by social contagion, like sort of an idea that people are exposed to, often through the internet and social media, which becomes a sort of gravitational pull for kids in general and young girls in particular, as they feel all the confusion that often comes with adolescence, and especially the confusion that comes with growing up today as a girl in a world where pornography is practically ubiquitous among among their peers, who on social media, all their friends will be posting perfect pictures of themselves that have been doctored by the social media filters. And every young girl looks at all her friends at how much prettier they are than she is and feels utterly inadequate. We're seeing huge rises in depression and anxiety. We're seeing epidemics of eating disorders and struggles of all kinds. And trans identity, is becoming, I'm very dangerous, is becoming a sort of portal out of that, a portal into a place where you're not just evaluated or like failing to make the grade of a young woman in our culture today. And many other sort of other mental health challenges are being masked by this sort of diagnosis, which increasingly is only on the basis of self-diagnosis. We're increasingly in a place where professionals, whether doctors or therapists, are basically not allowed to say to a troubled 13-year-old girl, actually, I think maybe what's going on here is not primarily gender dysphoria, but primarily you responding to the abuse that you experienced as a kid, or you responding to they're not even allowed to say that anymore because it's all about affirming their identity. So I think we're having huge pastoral challenges, and we need to sadly, very sadly, we need to own the ways in which our Christian culture has actually contributed to this. And that's where I'll end, because one of the most powerful arguments that goes around today runs something like this. Just like you white Christians in the 60s used your Bibles to oppose desegregation of schools and to oppose marriage between a black person and a white person, so now you're using your Bibles to justify your opposition to gay marriage for Christians and transgender identities. The moral capital of the civil rights movement has been harnessed by the gay rights movement and then now by the transgender rights movement, to where people think they are standing on the right side of history and they are campaigning for justice when they're insisting on the validity of transgender identities. And unless and until we, and I speak as a white evangelical in particular here, unless and until we are willing to properly own the fact that yes, many of our sort of spiritual forebears in the 60s were doing precisely that, we're not going to have the moral legs to stand on today. But here's the thing. The problem with the 60s segregationists was not that they were too Christian. It was they weren't half Christian enough. It wasn't that they were reading their Bibles too carefully. It was that they were absolutely desecrating the scriptures to try and reach the conclusions that they wanted to reach. And so the fix for us today is not to become less scriptural, it's to become more. And likewise, the final sort of stream that I think is fed into where we are today that we can own, the ways in which we have taken kind of cultural stereotypes of maleness and femaleness and sort of wedded them to the scriptures in our minds and in our teaching, to where a lot of Christians have grown up in Christian environments where they felt like if they didn't fit the stereotype, they didn't belong. We've actually sort of contributed to where we are today. The ways in which we've talked as if it's not just that we have sort of sexed bodies, male and female, but that we sort of somehow like have a sexed soul. You know, that there's something so fundamentally and essentially different about me psychologically than a man in these very prescriptive ways. That's actually oddly the same kind of argument that's being made by transgender activists today, to where they can say, well, I know my body is male or female, but my soul, and whether they use that term, like that's essentially the kind of idea that people have. I have a like oppositely sexed soul, and that my body now needs to conform to that. We've contributed to sowing the seeds of that thinking. Does that make sense? So there are ways in which we all need to go back to our Bibles, and I'm glad I didn't read this. It's in Psalm 120, which I'm sure has wonderful things to say. I don't know if it's particularly relevant to transgender identities. We need to make sure that what we're saying about men and women in response to this is scriptural and not just harking back to the stereotypes of 20, 30, 40, or 50 years ago. Because, as I said, the answer for people today is not to wind back 50 years. It's actually to look back 2,000 years to when the maker of the universe stepped into human history as a man and drew women to himself, died in the place of women, modeled what it looks like for a husband to love his wife, modeled what it looks like to be a single person. That's a whole other conversation. Living under the Lord in all completeness and glory. That's what women need today, is that the first century Jewish man named Jesus of Nazareth, who is alive and well and reigning today and will be coming back for them soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. We've ended with a little bit of time here, and I hope you all were as engaged and stimulated as I was. I hope it produced some questions, maybe some follow-up thoughts. And so we're going to have an opportunity for that now. Pastor Ryan, he's going to be walking around with the mic. And so if you have a question, I encourage you to raise your hand. Ryan will come to you. Rebecca and I will be up here on the stools. I'll mostly be sitting here. But you can ask Rebecca a question. I guess I'm game too, but you can ask me a question anytime. So these are for Rebecca. So at this point, feel free to have a question. You can raise your hand, and we'll be fielding them.
I'm not sure I heard everything. Am I supposed to stand up? I'm going to stand up.
Why not?
So I can see you better. I'm Brian Hux. I'm from Connecticut, North Carolina, but now Connecticut. And I appreciate how you dove into a lot of tough issues, all in like less than an hour. And you seem to be very carefully choosing your words, which I think we need more of, to parse out the conversation we're trying to have as opposed to maybe the conversation we veer into. It's hard for me to do that. And I know you've thought about these specific things a lot, and so maybe that's fairly straightforward to come and do here. I'm imagining that there's a tough topic that you haven't had a chance to spend many, many hours to research and prepare for. And I just wonder, are there some like starting questions or comments or things that you use to, I can't surprise you with a topic here today probably, but if someone were to accomplish that, kind of how you get the conversation started without it just turning into a train wreck.
Let me make sure I've understood you there just before you stand down.
Yeah.
Are you talking about how do we most fruitfully engage in controversial conversations of all kinds?
Yeah.
Just like what are our best under the Lord rhetorical strategies versus talking about any particular issue? Is that?
Right. Just in general, I wonder if there's something, if there's a framework you're using that has produced a lot of what you said today that might help us sort of think about, okay, well, she didn't talk about that one, so I don't have my notes on that one when it comes up.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's super helpful. Yeah, I do have a framework, which I don't follow rigidly, but hopefully will help in terms of thinking. And it's fourfold: listen, affirm, restate, explain. Listen, affirm, restate, explain. So if somebody, say you'd stood up and asked a really hard and potentially hostile question to me, which I wasn't really expecting. You guys are a friendly audience, but at times when there are the hostile questions. What I first want to do is listen very carefully to what the question is and where it's coming from. And I might want to ask a clarifying question to find out more, because as you will know from your experience as a pastor, there's often the question that somebody has, but in order to actually answer that question in a meaningful way, we need to know where that question is coming from for them. And one of the most important ways in which we can love people is to listen to them. I give a recent example. About a year ago, I got a sort of piece of hate mail through my website. Now, bizarrely, I talk about so many controversial things. I rarely get hate mail. But I got this message that just said, just an enormous F you. I sanitized it if you're hearing. And I thought, this is interesting. I have no idea who this person is. So I emailed back and I said, I don't know what you're going through or like how I've offended you, but I'm sorry. And she replied and was like, I can't believe you said that. Like my response was not pleasing to her. We went back and forth a couple of times. It turned out that she is a woman married to another woman who very much wants to go to a Bible teaching church and was feeling profoundly frustrated because the churches that are affirming of her marriage to this other woman are also churches that, as far as you can see, are kind of going off the like they're not teaching the Bible in meaningful ways, and it was very frustrating to her. And she was sort of seeing me and people like me, who I haven't mentioned this yet. Those of you who've read my books, I've always, as long as I can remember, I've been a Christian. As long as I can remember, I've been attracted to other women. So, and I talk about sexuality and Christianity, quite frequently upholding Christian sexual ethics, but not from the perspective of someone who just doesn't get it, but from the perspective of someone who would have been quite happy at one point in my Christian life to have read the scriptures and found they did affirm gay marriage, for example. It's not what I found. So we went back and forth a couple of times, and then it became kind of clear to me that our conversation wasn't really helping her. And so we stopped. And then several months later, she emailed me and she said, I would really appreciate it if you were willing to just have a Zoom call with me, because I would like to be able to tell you my story, and I've never been able to tell, as somebody in your position who's speaking and writing about these things, just my story. I said I'd love to do that. So we had a Zoom call for about an hour. She told me her history, which was painful and poignant, and I just listened. She knows where I stand. She knows what I believe. She'd read stuff and listened to podcasts and whatever. There was no need for me in that conversation to be by the way, the Bible doesn't affirm same-sex marriage. That wasn't what she needed from me. I just listened. And afterwards, she sent me an email with a Starbucks gift token saying, your next coffee is on me. The other day, she emailed me and she said, hi from your favorite hater-turned-fan. I was like, we sort of had a good laugh. Anyway, all I did was listen. So that's the first thing, listen. The second thing is affirm, and I want to be careful with that, because in our culture today, we talk and think, and Christians can feel this as well as non-Christians, as if in order to listen to somebody and in order to love them, you need to affirm everything they do and think. And if you don't affirm, from a Christian perspective, if you're well, I know I can't affirm certain choices that you're making, therefore I can't actually move towards you in love in any way. But in fact, the New Testament calls us time and again to love even our enemies, let alone people who are making choices that we couldn't as Christians make. So when I say listen and then affirm, what I mean is affirm what is best in what they're saying. Affirm the places where you can agree. Say you're talking with someone about abortion, and you say to them, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you profoundly care about vulnerable women who are not being supported and who are being abused. And you say, I profoundly care about that as well. There will almost always be pieces of what somebody's saying that we can affirm, because we Christians also believe that. And this brings us to our next point, which is restate. Almost before we respond to an argument or an objection, we want to make sure that we have heard it and even voiced it in its fullest form. Not just sort of grabbed at a straw man, but actually kind of added weight to their argument if necessary. Raise the tension on the potential conflict between what they're saying and the Christian faith. Make them feel, Tim Keller puts it like this, before we move to an answer, we want our non-Christian friends to be yes, that is exactly what I mean. That's the objection I really have in its fullest form. How on earth if there is supposedly a loving God who is in control of all things, how on earth could he allow the sort of suffering that we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment? To give it space to breathe that objection. And after having listened, affirmed what we can, restated in its strongest form what the objection is, then to explain why we believe that actually Jesus, rather than being the opposite of what's needed in this situation, is in fact precisely who we need in this situation. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So I just want to push back on one thing.
Yeah.
In my experience, most churches I've been a part of did not idolize marriage. Mm-hmm. They just kind of ignore it, or they're complementarian but kind of embarrassed.
Yeah.
We're just not going to go there. We're going to take, desiccated gender roles. Yeah, Ephesians is there, but we're not going to really get into that. I mean, you beautifully exegeted that passage. I just want to say, marriage is an icon of God and his church, Christ and his church. But what do you say when people who were raised in such churches that don't do much with marriage, when they grew up to be like the women you talked about in the very beginning, from D.C., New York? I've seen many of these same people, and people in our churches who are now saying, I'm in this marriage that's miserable, and now I have to go to Andrew Tate or these other internet personalities to get something that my church should have told me about men and women, and so there's like they feel lied to because they feel like they haven't been given instructions, like you'll figure it out like your parents and grandparents did. And they're coming to us, and that they either want to be married, or their marriages are falling apart, they're loveless, and now they're going to these internet celebrities. I think that's, not every church is the same. Some do idolize marriage, but I think many of us are in the very opposite kind of place.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And just to be clear, I don't think that when I say we've idolized marriage, that we have spent our time giving like wonderful scripture-filled instruction on what marriage is and isn't. What I mean is, and I'm almost hesitant to give this example because I don't mean it disrespectfully to my lovely Christian mother-in-law, but my lovely Christian mother-in-law from Oklahoma prayed for my husband's wife from when he was tiny. And she said this to him, and she said it to me. And on the one hand, that's lovely. Like, I've had this lovely Christian woman in Oklahoma praying for me since I was a kid. Like, great. Who doesn't need more prayers? However, it sets the expectation that her son would, of course, get up and grow up and get married, and that there is no. If we raise our kids that way, those of us who have kids, then two things will happen. Either they'll get married and become disappointed because we acted like marriage was the destination, not the signpost to the much greater thing of Jesus' love. Or they won't get married, and they'll feel and they will be treated, whether explicitly or implicitly, as like, oh, that's kind of unfortunate. Because, really the Christian best is to get married, and this is, again, I mentioned, there are more Christian women than men. So even just like on a numbers game, even if the ideal was for every Christian to get married, the only way Christian women could do that would be marrying non-believers, right? That's not what we're looking for. If we go back to the scriptures, and you know this, I'm sure, better than I do, Paul, who said Christian marriage was so great that it's a picture of Jesus in the church, he said singleness is even better. And we have completely, again, I don't want to project my experience or the experience of others I've spoken to onto you guys. Perhaps your churches have always been very different than this. Too often, we have not presented a compelling, gospel-centered vision for Christian singleness. Not just as a temporary place on the way to marriage, which for some people it will be, but actually as a valid way of living as a Christian in its own right. And so that's what I mean when I say we've idolized marriage, that we haven't seen both marriage and singleness as equally valid expressions of faithfulness to the Lord, with their different challenges and opportunities. And last thought, Christian singleness only really works if we are serious about Christian community ethics, if we're actually scriptural about the church being family, not the nuclear family being family. But here's the thing, I think Christian marriage only works that way too.
Good afternoon, my name is Tom, I'm from Stamford, Connecticut. I have a three-part question, so hopefully I can keep this straight, and hopefully we all can as well. It has to do with what you said about, in order for the church to get the moral legs to stand on to address issues of women's rights or of transgenderism, they have to acknowledge, or I forget the specific word you used, but deal with the evangelicals church's history with regard to race. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. So the three parts of my question are, what sphere are you talking about there? Is that in one-on-one conversations? Is that in academia? Is that in everything? Part two, what does it look like? And can you give an example of somebody reclaiming their moral legs. And then part 3 is, if we say that, does that lead to people then saying, okay, you Christians just use the Bible however you want? Mm-hmm. Back in the 60s, they did that, now you're doing this, and it even discredits the Bible even further.
Yeah. Great, helpful questions. I think that what we need to do today is something that Christians should be really good at doing, and that's repenting and believing. Typically, when people react to the sort of yard sign mentality, they lean one of two ways on that. So there are Christians who will look at those signs and say, I'm profoundly aware of the history of racial injustice. And I've been told that all these other things are sort of bundled together with caring about racial justice. And so I'm going to lament and in meaningful ways sort of, repent of the sins of my tribe when it comes to how, if I'm speaking as a white evangelical, how we have treated our black brothers and sisters. But I'm not going to do the hard thing of believing the very countercultural, unpopular things the Bible says when it comes to sexuality and gender. Folks on the other side will be like, well, I'm ready to stand on what the scriptures say when it comes to gender and sexuality, but I really definitely want to sort of gloss over the history of sin in my particular kind of Christian tribe. I think we actually need to do both. So an example, and I'm not thinking of any particular Christian school, but were I suddenly working at a Christian school, as in a high school, one of the first things I would do is say, would be to look at the fact that like a large proportion of Christian K through 12 or like high schools were founded as a way for white Christians to get their kids out of desegregated schools. And that wasn't long ago. This is not long ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is, the generation of my in-laws, for instance, who were growing up at that time, when these supposedly Christian schools were being founded to propagate segregation. Now, my sincere hope is that the large majority of Christian schools today are horrified by that's not at all what they want to be doing. But at what point, between the 60s and now, did that school, the leadership of that school, stand up and say, do you know what? We royally sinned. The very foundation of this school was sinful foundation. And that doesn't necessarily mean we need to disband the school and not, continue to educate kids. But it does mean that we need to educate our kids, including the history of the school, actually. That's just one example. But I think there are ways in which, if we just say, oh, look at our lovely Christian school, our non-believing friends, and speaking as a white Christian, my black brothers and sisters, are going to see straight through that as us not actually owning the sins of our past.
Thank you. I'm Ben from Alton, New Hampshire. Looking at those first 3 ones, it takes a lot of cultural finesse to sort those out on themselves, even a lot of more theological finesse to understand how Jesus helps us understand those first 3. So I'm thinking about my kids and my church and thinking, your kids are in public schools. How do you help your kids and also our churches have that theological finesse to see these are actually we're misunderstanding these because we're not seeing how they connect with Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so how do we actually teach that for people who are maybe immature and growing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so my kids are 12, 10, and 4, and all in People's Republic of Cambridge schools. And I need to have conversations with them about gender and sexuality from the get-go. I think there's been a general mentality among Christian parents that maybe wait until your kid's 13, 14, 15, and questions will come up, and then we'll have conversations. That's not going to work, because they've already had they've already been discipled by those around them by that point. And to put that more positively, if sex and marriage is ultimately about Jesus and the church, we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about that with our kids from ages 3 and 4. Like, actually, we should be building theological foundations from our earliest conversations with them. And likewise, when it comes to race and equality and love across racial difference, I mean, which is, again, something that seems like it should be a self-evident moral truth today, is actually a specifically Christian belief. It's something that, when we read the pages of the New Testament, because our racial and cultural barriers are not the same as the ones in the first century, we often miss it. We weren't raised to hate the Samaritans. But when we start to see the radical ways in which Jesus was breaking through every racial and cultural barrier of his day, and then commanding his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, as we teach that to our kids from the ground up, then when they go to school and they're told that diversity is a sort of counter-Christian value, they'll know from the first that that's not true. Now, those in the room who have kids will know that conversations with your children need to happen sort of early and often. My best friend, Rachel, who's an amazing testimony of coming to Christ when she was an undergrad at Yale after her girlfriend left her, came out to her 8-year-old daughter for like the 5th time the other week. And her daughter was like seemingly sort of shocked that her mum had previously been in these lesbian relationships and then had become a Christian. And she apparently came to her afterwards. She was like, "Does Dad know?" And Rachel was like, "Yes, Dad knows." But somehow, and I found this with my kids at similar ages, I'm like, wait a minute, we talked about this a few months ago. We talked about this a year. Like, conversations came up and then they keep coming up. And I think that's just often how kids learn that they actually need. It's not just there'll be the one conversation you have and let's pick the age at which it happens. Also, and last thing I'll say on that, I couldn't read the Bible with my kids without telling them about sex. It actually comes up quite a lot, one way and another. So unless we're saying, well, don't read the Bible to your kids until, one day when you're willing to talk to them about sex, I'm like, let's just have the conversations early.
Let's do one more question over here.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. You mentioned about kind of the gender fluidity issues, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor has to kind of affirm. Pastorally, how do you work with that parent who's, in a sense, struggling with their kids, but at the same time thinks they need to affirm as opposed to deal with some of the underlying issues? Just curious, pastorally, kind of what you've thought and how to approach that.
Yeah, and that's really, really, really hard. I hear from parents quite frequently who are saying that their kid is adopting some form of transgender identity, and the forms are various. It's especially common at the moment for adolescent girls to identify as non-binary and to want to be called they, them, and sort of neither male nor female. You particularly use the language of gender fluidity, which is it's a whole other thing in people's minds. My 12-year-old has a friend who considers herself gender fluid, so depending on the day, she'll either want to be called he or she or they, and it's sort of, there is a fluidity to it. Other folks will say, no, I am a trans boy or trans girl, and like, that is a very given thing, and not at all I'm somewhere on the spectrum, but I'm like fully the other thing. So it's always worth us just, being aware of the amount of complexity, even if it's just complexity in how people are thinking about themselves versus like any kind of real meaningful complexity in its own right. How we deal pastorally is so complicated and hard, not least because, as I mentioned, for a significant proportion of kids who are identifying as some form of transgender or other, there will be other things going on too. There's a lot of evidence that kids who identify as actually LGBT or T are at far higher risk of suicidal attempts than kids who don't. And this is particularly true of those who identify on the transgender spectrum sort of somewhere. So we need to have And people will debate why that is. So from folks on the left, they'll say, well, of course, it's because of all the transphobic treatment that they get. And if you don't affirm your child's transgender identity, you might as well sign their death warrant. Folks that, conservatives on the other hand will say, no, this is because transgender or gender dysphoria is only ever connected to another mental health challenge, and sort of wanting to kind of draw in very large brush strokes there. And I think we always need to be careful to recognize these situations are usually complicated, and to do a lot of listening to kind of understand the particulars of the scenario. I think it is profoundly important that we don't let very young people make irreparable decisions about their bodies that they may come to regret later on. I mean, at the moment, we let kids who are not old enough to vote or, buy alcohol make decisions that will affect their future potential fertility and other, other areas of their life sort of irreparably. So I don't have any kind of silver bullet pastoral answer as you work with parents and with kids. I think we need to affirm that God made us male and female, and that's good. I think we need to recognize, and I didn't have time to mention this, but there's a small proportion of people who are born with a disorder of sexual development, to where from birth, or sometimes this can emerge in adolescence, it becomes apparent that they are not actually typically male or female. It's not that there is a third sex, but it's that just like any other part of our body, thanks to the fall, can be, I could have been born with a hearing impediment or with, problems with my eyes. So there are kids, and I have a friend who has 2 children in this situation, who are chromosomally male, but were originally identified as female at birth. And when we hear that language, it's become very common in transgender sort of conversations to say, so-and-so was assigned female at birth but turned out to be male, or assigned male at birth but turned out to be female. There are very few cases when that actually is, my friend's kids were assigned female at birth, and then they did, but then one of the nurses was like, wait a minute, I think there's maybe something unusual going on here. And it turned out that they're actually, genetically male, but their development has been such that they look more female than male. And there may be folks like that in our congregations who are profoundly hurt when we talk in sort of uncareful ways about transgender identity, because they have no option other than to be like, I'm sort of having to guess at whether to raise my kid as a male or as a female. So I think we need to do a lot of listening, but we also need to do a lot of, the hardest aspect, or one of the hardest aspects of parenting, is making decisions for my kids that they don't want, right? And there'll be times when we need to stand with Christian parents to say, actually, don't let your child take the puberty blocking drugs. Just say no.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Will you all join me in thanking her?